Okay. I'm gonna try to record these car recordings with my lav, see if I can make it a little bit better quality. Um, so the setup in here is kind of weird when it comes to that. So uh, I don't know. I'll do the best that I can. Anyway, today's question is authenticity a virtue or just a modern obsession? Is authenticity a virtue or just a modern obsession? And I think I sort of have to say it's a virtue, right? Since it really develops for me the positive half of my own ethical outlook. The first half is being free from force and violence, refraining from force and violence. The second being authenticity. And I define authenticity as both coming to know and objectifying who you really are, right? That is, who you are when you are not forced to conform yourself in a way for the sake of survival, either socially or, in terms of markets and labors and during, if you had to ask yourself the question, okay, I don't have to worry about work, right? I can do whatever I want to do. What would you do? What would you be acting for the sake of? And in the same breath, if I didn't have to worry about the social judgments of other people, if I didn't have to worry about ostracism, then what would I act for the sake of, right? And if you combine, in my ethical outlook, if you combine freedom from force and refraining from the use of force with the practice of authenticity, this is the closest that you can get to philosophically, secularly, to a good life, because you understand what you actually value and you are capable of acting for the sake of it in a free environment where you actually know what it is that you value, rather than sort of running off of these unconscious scripts that are based in fear and survival and necessity. And I believe moving society and individuals forward into that kind of ethical environment as a whole. So obviously, to me, authenticity must be a kind of virtue, not only because it is the basis of a good life, but because it is at the same time a practice. Yes, it's a practice, and a practice, by the way, that must come up against a lot of internal fear and civilizational blocks, because the truth is that these things, that inauthenticity is tied to survival a lot of the times. A lot of times we have to fake it in order to get along. A lot of times we have to, work the job that we don't want to work in order to feed ourselves, right? And we live in a world that is based on violence and force, and that makes this entire process much more difficult than it needs to be, much more difficult than it would be otherwise in an actually free world. And so authenticity is not simply a virtue in the sense that it is a good practice, but it is a heroic virtue in the sense that the person who is truly authentic in the modern world is a person who has really worked against and probably had to make sacrifices for the sake of that authenticity, right? They've had to sacrifice social acceptance to one degree or another. They perhaps had to sacrifice financial opportunities for the sake of authenticity. They perhaps had to have sacrificed relationships for the sake of authenticity. There's all kinds of sacrifices, social and otherwise, that come from trying to understand yourself. Never mind the actual time and the resources that it often takes to even begin the practice of trying to understand yourself and trying to act for the sake of who you really are. And so it's not simply a virtue. It's in one sense a heroic virtue. It is the main virtue. It is the virtue by which everything else, in my view, comes out of, besides the refraining from force and violence itself, the creativity of, okay, how am I going to live my authentic life without recourse to force and violence? That is the essence of the ethical life. Is authenticity a modern obsession? Well, I'm not even sure I'm not sure that most people really understand what authenticity is, right? There's an extent to which people look at authenticity today as basically the same as impulsiveness, that the first instinct or the first thought or the first emotion that comes from their mind should just be instantaneously expressed and acted upon. And of course, this is not a example of authenticity, at least not in most cases, because you are more than your instincts. You're more than that momentary emotion. You're more than the one value that comes to your mind. You're a very complex whole. And if you look inside of yourself, you're going to see that kind of complexity. You're going to see the conflicts of the hierarchy within you. You're going to see that there are multiple drives in you, multiple things all reaching towards the same thing. And in the moment, it's hard to parse that and to have that internal negotiation and figure out, actually do the work of figuring out, okay, what's the best kind of value that I can act on right here? Again, a lot of that shows up in your history. A lot of that shows up in how you've lived your life up until this point, that you can start to see the trajectory of the meaning of your life. This is why it's important to analyze your past. This is why it's important to journal. This is one of the reasons that I'm sitting here making this YouTube channel and these videos, because I want to be able to see in my future where my history has gotten me to, how I've developed so far from the point in the past to where I am now. That's part of learning about your true self. And so the true self is not about authenticity, because it turns out that a large part of yourself is your reason, a large part of yourself is your mind, a large part of yourself is the values that you are acting for the sake of in the long term, not just in the immediate. There are values in the immediate, and there are values in the long term, and there are values in the midterm, and there is a constant negotiation that is happening between those. And so it's not merely instinctual. And I think people associate it maybe with instinct, because the instinct is a lot easier, right? It's easier just to act on your impulses than it is to come to the complex and nuanced understanding of yourself that really never ends and that grows over time, and to negotiate with yourself and to figure out, okay, how am I actually going to structure my day, my week, my month, my year, such that as far as possible, it gets me to an authentic place. And people too often uncritically accept the values that are at the surface of themselves as their authentic selves. And so they act on those values and they think, well, I've been authentic and look, I'm not happy, right? So I should be inauthentic. I should go after something else that I don't value, which the logic behind that doesn't make any sense to me. But oftentimes these surface values, these are the values that have been fed to you as a child. These are the values that you've been socially conditioned to accept. These are the values that you've been trained. These are the values that have gone unquestioned. And now that is what you're acting on, right? Not your true self, not who you would be if your parents didn't judge you, your friends didn't judge you, your job didn't judge you, if your survival was not in one way or another dependent on your inauthenticity. All that sort of cuts you off from who you are. It cuts you off from the truth. The process of authenticity is not one where even if you wake, first of all, if you wake up, you have to in the first place, you have to wake up to the fact that you are inauthentic. You have to wake up to the fact that you are socially conditioned. You have to wake up to the fact that you have been trained as a child, that many of the values that you hold them because they're based on survival, not because they're true to yourself. But even once you come to that recognition that you have a false self, right? And then you're acting on inauthentic values. Even once you come to that kind of recognition, that doesn't mean that you suddenly become authentic. In fact, as you start to identify and peel away those layers of your false self, and you reach the bottom of that, there usually isn't something solid there. There isn't something solid there because you haven't had the opportunity to develop it, because those opportunities have been taken from you as a child and as an adult through the conditioning, through forcing this survival instinct on you, the inauthentic instinct. And the inauthentic instinct is not purely bad. I mean, it keeps you alive, and you still have to negotiate with it as you become more authentic. But at the bottom of all of the superficial values, there's not necessarily a solid self there yet, because it's yet to be developed. You have to get to the authentic instinct, which is about truth, which is about who am I, which is about experimenting and testing the things, rationally over time, not about instinct in terms of just acting on whatever comes to your mind in the first instant, but boldly and with courage, acting on, I call them value premises, right? That acting on a sense of where you want to go, acting on it, testing that, right? Saying, okay, does this actually bring me happiness, fulfillment, meaning, whatever, revising your understanding and continue the testing process and updating that over time. That's supposed to take place in childhood, but childhood is not a free environment. It's a force-based, constrained, and socially conditioned environment. In fact, most of parenting advice today is geared towards socializing the child, right? So I think that the obsession, so to speak, with authenticity, I mean, that kind of authenticity is not the authenticity that I'm talking about. That authenticity is impulsiveness. That authenticity is just acting on the superficial values that you've been conditioned and haven't questioned yet. Uh, Real authenticity is oftentimes a difficult and long process of self understanding. So uh, it certainly is a virtue. It certainly is a virtue because it's a practice. It's something that you get better over time. It is essential for the good life, and in most circumstances, it's heroic. I would like to get the world to a place where authenticity didn't have to be heroic, but in a world like this that is so buried in fear of death and survival, authenticity is heroic.